Okay. Hello, everyone. We're continuing within Divine Friendship, Swami Kriyananda's wonderful book of letters. Um, Usually we have Keshava chanting at the beginning of the class, but he took his vaccination shot today, and he's not quite up to it. Let's just put it like that. So it's nice to have him protected, but we will not have his company this evening. Presumably by tomorrow he'll be himself again. So let's start with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, dear friend and guide Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to feel your presence ever living within us and to hear the wisdom guidance of your inner voice. Show us the way that leads to true happiness and inspire us with courage and dedication and clarity that we may make the right choices and use our energy in such a way that it brings us closer and closer to the light. Om. Peace. Amen. Let's just have a moment of silence and then we'll start. Om. Peace. Amen. So, yes, last time we were together, we finished the section about Ananda, which was a lot about chanting, but it was also about other things. So now we're into a section called Insights and Commentary, which is obviously everything that didn't fit somewhere else gets to be put into this one. So it's an eclectic collection that will be quite entertaining for us, I think. So the first letter was written on May 1st, 1999, and the summary is, a psychologist objected to statements by Kriyananda criticizing psychology. This is sort of an ongoing battle. Battle, is that the right word? An ongoing discussion that was always going on all the years that Swami was living between the practices of psychology and the practices of yoga, which may appear to a certain extent have a lot in common, but there are certain points where they diverge. And sometimes Swami spoke very frankly about those divergences, and sometimes the proponents and the practitioners of psychology protested. So this is what we're working with here. Swami writes, I appreciate your letter, and of course you're right. See, there we go again. We've had other letters from Swami, haven't we, where someone has objected, and Swami starts his letter by conceding that their argument has merit. Swami never felt the need to sort of stand by his position and just defend it no matter what. If somebody raised a good point, the first thing he would say is, you're right. So I appreciate your letter, and of course you're right. When psychology is practiced as you yourself practice it, with devotion and spiritual insight, it can help people greatly. I wasn't addressing the many individuals who personally have the wisdom to practice it rightly. I was addressing a movement which, taken as a whole, has become more an industry than a profession. So this is the same conversation we've had earlier about Christianity and quite a few other subjects, where Swami will look at a trend and he'll speak against that trend. And then individuals will protest that there are many exceptions to that trend. And then Swami will defend, as he's about to in this letter, that nonetheless, despite the fact that there are exceptions to what he's presenting, that what he's presenting is still the essential quality of what he's describing. Forgive me for not making it clearer. And once again, Swami's perfectly willing to accept that he made a mistake. For what it is that Swami will hold to the main point and will concede everything around it that he can concede in order to make it clear that he's listening. But if he really still feels strongly about the main point, he won't concede that unless he should. Forgive me for not making it clearer, but when one sees a need for iconicalism, one cannot attack the icon with an epi. An epi must be a lightweight sword, I think. One must use a mace. At least that is how I see it. Psychology is evolving, thank God, but there is much in the field that is damaging to spiritual development, and more reports of studies are indicating either that psychology, as often practiced, is not only relatively unhelpful, but may even be doing harm. So Swami has not really backed off, has he? And he emphatically held to the position that many of the cherished ideals of psychology are actually antithetical to self-realization as Master taught it. And that's hard for some people to accept, but Swami was firm on it. An interesting study, for example, was made a year after a massive layoff of auto workers in Detroit. The government was able to afford counseling for only about a third, I believe that was the figure, of the people who'd lost their jobs. The study found that those who had received no counseling ended up better off psychologically than those who had received it. Now that's pretty depressing, isn't it? Especially if you're a psychologist. The uncounseled had adjusted better to their new circumstances, had gone out and found new jobs instead of dwelling on their misfortune, and felt much more in control of their own lives. One critic of the industry, Noam Chomsky, observed, "One waits in vain for psychologists to state the limits of their knowledge." Boy, Swami's really armed and ready for this one, isn't he? I'm going to see if Swami deals with the auto worker more, and if not, I'll go back and pick it up. No, he goes on for pages, so let's see what happens. Psychologists have touted the benefits of their profession, but by and large have remained silent on its possible weaknesses. Swami always says that if a person, well, he talks about an experience he had when he was 15. And I can't remember whether he went to some, when he was a teenager, I'm not sure exactly when, he went to some camp, and it might have been like a political camp or something like that. The detail escaped me. Or maybe it was just a conference. But someone had stood up and talked about, I don't know what the subject was, some aspect of socialism or government involvement in some aspect of life, or maybe it had something to do with medicine. But it was some proposed program that was going to solve a lot of social problems. And after the person had presented their story, their point of view with great strength, somebody said, well, you've done a very good job of explaining the strengths of what you're proposing. What are the weaknesses? And the speaker said, there are no weaknesses. And Swami's response, well, this man can't know much about his subject, because every human endeavor has a positive and a negative side. So this comment from this authority that one waits in vain for psychologists to see what their limits are, and Swami says psychologists talk about the benefits, but they never talk about the weaknesses. They never talk about the limits of their profession. Now, of course, Swami's talking in essential terms. He's not talking about every psychologist that lived. You know, the reason why, in the case of these auto workers, just to address that point, when Swami had talked about it in other contexts, because that made an impression on him, why would that be true? And of course, everything depends on the psychologist. But I'll put it like this. When Swami was training us, giving us an idea of how to be good counselors, one of the things he said, which was very interesting, he said, when people present to you the difficulties and dilemmas they're facing, And this was the advice to Ananda ministers. He says you should be sympathetic, but not too sympathetic. He said if you're too sympathetic, it reinforces the idea in the person's mind that what they have is really a big problem. And so if somebody is suffering and you just sort of tell them how justified they are and how difficult what they're facing is and how anybody would be overwhelmed with it, which is what you might do in an effort to help someone, but it can also reinforce in that person's mind that something really bad has happened to them. So it's a fine line, because if you're insufficiently sympathetic, you can also lose the connection with the person that you're trying to help. So who knows who these psychologists were, but one of the possible explanations for what happened is that those who received counseling were allowed to spend a lot of time thinking about the difficulties they'd faced and how unfair it was and how overwhelming it was and all these different things. So instead of gaining energy for a positive forward motion, they developed the inclination to just nurse their grievances. Whereas those who had no opportunity to sort of discuss it and think about it and dwell in it, just went forward and did something else. Now, ideally and obviously, the ideal counseling is where you recognize it, you acknowledge it, and then you are aided in being able to face and overcome it. Because the point is to face and overcome. Merely to recognize and describe can be an absolute dead end. We have to learn to face and to overcome, to keep moving forward in life. So it's subtle. So studies have been quoted as proving that the longer a person receives treatment, the more benefits he receives, whereas what those studies actually demonstrated was the very opposite. In other words, the promotional tactics being used by psychologists are too often reminiscent of advertising gimmicks rather than the serious reporting of conscientious scientists. Wow, Swami's not really giving these people any space here, is he? But he's not. Swami has no axe to grind. He just really wants to make a point. And it's also true in 1999, through the 90s, one of the things that happened, and Ananda was caught up in it, was there was kind of a rebellion in, well, the 1990s, ending in 1998, is when Swami and Ananda were accused of gross misconduct. You know, financial, sexual, authority, everything. That was the whole Bertolucci lawsuit, which I've talked about in other places. But what also happened in several other ashrams is this kind of psychology movement sort of took hold in the ashram. And it tried to take hold at Ananda during that period of time, which is that we have to, that there was an effort made to persuade within our community, which did not get as much traction as it got in a couple of other ashrams, that we all really needed to, let me think how to say it. We needed to give more credibility to the difficulties we'd had in life. We needed to have the opportunity to be recognized when we were victims and to demand that others be accountable for our actions, for our suffering. I'm trying to think of how to put it in exactly the right way. A certain amount of it was, yeah, let's be real about how we feel. Let's not just think that the way to be a yogi is to pretend that everything is always fine. That's just silly. And Swami had never suggested that. Suppressing who you really are does not make you a spiritual person. You have to be fearless in your willingness to see yourself honestly and truly. The question then comes, what happens next? And there was a movement, as I said, that sort of tried to get a foothold at Ananda, but it just couldn't, where people just sat around and talked about how much they'd suffered, but without a corresponding recognition that this happens to everyone, and we have to move forward. At one point, Swami, just to answer that energy, he said, everybody has trauma in their background. The past life, this life, or the past lives. We do not come to the spiritual path unless we have suffered in this world. And we can just look around. Some people can look no farther than their own incarnation this time. But we can look around and we can see how much suffering there is in this world. And I certainly know that part of my progression through the spiritual life is to become unafraid of that, unafraid of my own experience. I like many, tried to just kind of avoid it a little bit. But once I know it's there, and once I'm unafraid to say, heartbreak, disappointment, sorrow, shame, all of these things live in me as well as in everyone else. But what is the way out of it? Now, in terms of psychology, sometimes I really appreciate it's impossible to understand oneself without an impartial mirror sitting in front of you, in the form of a wise person who can help you. Otherwise, and I saw this classically in a very short-lived marriage that took place within our community, each one in that couple did not understand where their suffering really came from. They didn't understand themselves enough to know what was really causing them pain. So they found each other, and he would say or do something that caused her to suffer. And because it happened sequentially, she thought that his actions were causing her suffering. And then she would do something that would cause him to suffer, and because it happened sequentially, he thought her actions were causing his suffering. But both of them were walking around with just unacknowledged, unresolved griefs. And they just kept reminding each other of those griefs, thinking that the other was the cause of it. So when we don't know where our suffering is coming from, when it's unacknowledged within us, and it's a dark mystery to us, it can be very helpful to have someone help you understand yourself. But once we've reached a fundamental level where we know what we've been through and we know who we are, what comes after that? Because the teachings of self-realization, the word that comes to mind the most they're draconian. That nothing happens to us except that it's our karma that it happened. And it happens to everyone. And it's always for our own good. That is extremely hard teaching. It's a very hard teaching. And before I impose it or even present it to people, I'm just talking to no one that's in front of me at this moment, but when there's people in the room, I'm very careful, because really hard things have happened to people, and I don't want to be the one to tell them something they're not ready to hear. But nonetheless, that is the teaching. And you can skirt around it as much as you want. And what started happening in the yoga movement, which is why Swami is so firm here, is that people wanted to be acknowledged as victims, and they wanted those who they felt had victimized them to be held accountable. Swami said, that's the death of yoga. The way Sister Gyanamata put it is essentially, as soon as I start blaming someone else, who could... Now, the way I think about it is this. Many other people can participate in my karma, but they don't actually cause it. Because if it wasn't mine to have it happen, then there would be no one to participate in it. So somewhere in myself, now, once again, and I say this very strongly, this is a very hard teaching. And I've spent a lifetime, step by step, coming to the point where I can really just say it out loud. That not that I can say it without sadness, without sorrow, without grief, but I can also say it with truth. And if, whether it's a psychologist or whoever it is, tries to guide you away from that fundamental truth. It may be a necessary stage in your personal and spiritual growth, but ultimately one has to come to a different answer. And so that's what Swami's addressing. And one of the reasons he's so firm on this is one ashram in particular of a teacher who was a friend of Swamiji's. Swamiji watched that teacher, because he was Indian, thinking that he was helping his American students by allowing them to go very deeply in a psychological direction in a way that wasn't helpful. And Swami watched it and he said, it's the end of the ashram. And it was. It is, the ashram just fell apart as a consequence. So Swami has a lot behind what he's saying here. He's not just talking to this one. And he starts out by saying, you're right. You have the wisdom to be a very good psychologist. Because many people, even those who come to Ananda or come onto the spiritual path, need psychological help. They need someone to help unravel knots that they haven't had the courage or the clarity to unravel yet. And I've never seen it work. I've never seen it work that someone who has some deep psychological issue, which many of us do, have a deep psychological issue, and sometimes people will come to the spiritual path because they think they get to avoid it. It's like, I will, quote, give it to God, which means I will never have to look at it. But the flaw in that is, if I open your wallet and give your money to the church, it's not my gift because it wasn't my money. So if we say, I'm going to give this to God, but haven't yet had the courage to really own it, this really happened to me. This was really my karma to have this experience. God gave it to me and now I give it back to God. To just be able to be at peace with it. And then you can give it away. But what I've seen is, if you come to the spiritual path because I hope to avoid having to face all that and having to do the work that's required, it never works. I mean, the good news is it never works. I mean, sometimes you can kind of, and this is God's own way, sometimes you'll spend and I've been with this long enough to see it, 20 or 25 years, strengthening yourself in other ways, but then I've seen it always inserts itself. Sometimes dramatically, sometimes as a helpful revelation. But sooner or later, if you're sincere, everything has to be resolved. And everything will be resolved. You don't have to go seeking it. It'll come to you if you really want it to, if you really want to get clear. So, Swami goes on to say, let's see, where were we? He's talking about the promotional tactics of some psychologists. I don't question that there are many serious therapists, but I have seen the results of a great deal of quackery, and I do not believe that the mind, without the adjunction of intuition, is capable of reasoning its way out of its difficulties. What it seems to do is go in circles from one room of ego consciousness to another. You see, that's the essential problem. They will just keep talking about this, but you have to raise your energy. You have to raise your vibration. You have to raise your intuitive perception of reality beyond what the ego keeps feeding you. And what Swami's really talking about is this very long, ongoing therapy that never goes beyond, as he says, well, he said it himself, from one room of ego to another. So he's writing to this person. Swami says, you are a good person with high ideals. That is what you want to see in everyone, and it's laudable of you. Would that as many were like you as you claim. Sadly, I've seen a lot of wounded on the battlefield as a result of psychoanalytical treatment. Swami was very definite about that. People who'd spent years, through that sort of thing, he saw them more self-preoccupied than ever. So rather than transcending the limits of ego consciousness, he felt too often they had merely built bigger walls. That didn't mean that the psychology itself never, well, they went from room to room. But Swami's talking about true health, not just a temporary, not just an aspirin. Are they at least better than they were before? What I think is that perhaps their psychic limp has become less pronounced. Gosh, well, he's not giving any quarter on this one. Not much better than that. Meditation and the spiritual insights you've developed, and a few others are developing, can help people a great deal more. So you have to integrate a spiritual understanding with a psychological one to really be able to help people. So I'm not at all saying don't keep doing what you're doing. Keep at it. The world needs more people like you. There's a great deal of confusion and twisted understanding out there that needs to be addressed. But I lived with Master, and I saw how masterfully he helped people, always leaving it to them to rise to a higher level of understanding, and giving them suggestions without ever trying to force his wisdom on anyone. Superconscious guidance is, as you've put it, and as I too have often put it, is solution-oriented. And in this sense is very different from the problem consciousness with which the conscious mind is so easily infected. Classically, psychology tries to get people to face their problems honestly, a worthy effort, but one which too often has led people to dwell too much on their problems. Solutions can't be found merely by thinking one's way to them. They come from inspiration, and inspiration comes from raising the level of consciousness to a level where it is able to penetrate through the clouds of reason. Self-honesty is essential, but must not become ingrown to the point of becoming obsessive. So that's what he's trying to say. Too often he's seen that people who are too psychologically oriented just become fascinated with their own difficulties. And they just spend their time in that. And there's no changing of the level of consciousness. I mean, this is the whole premise of yoga, is that when we change our vibration of consciousness, then everything that's on a lower vibration gets transformed into the higher vibration. And it's that transformation that we're really looking for, where it isn't just a question of acknowledging, it's freeing ourselves from the compelling energy of whatever it is that we've experienced in the past, so that our consciousness doesn't keep just looping into that vritti, into that whirlpool of feeling and fear and whatever it might be, anger, dismay, whatever the qualities are. Yes, of course, I am generalizing. One can't really do otherwise if one wants to address broad issues, unless one is willing to go the statistical route. But then that route often bogs down in detail, to the point where solutions are no longer even sought. My approach is admittedly particular. Other approaches are needed also for final changes to be made. Let's hope my small voice will make a little impact, however. Please forgive me for offending you. I feel your sincerity and that you are a friend, even though we haven't met. Joy to you. In Divine Friendship, Swami. So, a practicing psychologist complained to Swami about his sweeping condemnation of her, I think it was a woman, of her profession. And Swami said, I wasn't talking about you, but I am talking about a lot of your colleagues. And he wouldn't back off from his essential point. But if her call in life is to uplift and reform that profession, then he's all for it. And then he speaks so sweetly to her. Once again, I'm sorry I offended you. I can feel that you're sincere, and I can tell that you're a friend. It's very nice. See, Swamiji can completely disagree with someone, but he doesn't, it's not personal. Personally, he's quite positive toward this person, but that doesn't mean he agrees with them. And he's able to run both realities easily. I feel that you're a friend. I feel you're very sincere. And no, I don't agree with a great deal that you're trying to get me to agree with. I just don't. So for a person to also be a friend of Swami, you have to be able to deal with that. You have to be able to deal with the fact, I would use the word that he never flatters the ego. He just never flattered the ego. He was just always truthful. He was kind, and he would reach out to you. You're right. You've said things. I'm sorry I offended you. You're a good person. And I still feel this way. And so the challenge that many of us faced with Swamiji was being able to have him, disagree with you, often powerfully disagree with things that you might, your once cherished beliefs, and be as impersonal about that as he was. His friendship for us was not based on the fact that we always agreed with him, or that everything he said was just what we wanted to hear. Our friendship had to be based on a shared commitment to find the truth in every situation, and the courage to see it through. And so this is, like this. I don't know. I have a suspicion who this letter was to, but I don't have a real strong feeling. But in similar circumstances, I have observed that when Swami sometimes would disagree as forcefully as he has done here with something that a person was very attached to, they would often misremember even what he had exactly said, because they would hear it too powerfully. And then sometimes on several occasions, someone would say, when I got that letter from Swamiji, I just read it once and put it away. And then like a year or two later, they would pull it out, and they would suddenly see how very supportive he was being. But they had reacted to the fact that they had different ideas. So this was Swami must have felt, well, he did, that this person was sincere and a friend, so he wasn't going to mince words. He would always be sincere. There was a very interesting experience. I wrote it up in my book about Swami Kriyananda as we have known him. There was this woman, and she lived in the United States, I won't say where. She was part of an old, she was heir to generational wealth, and generational wealth on a very high scale that put her, among the richest people in the country. This was 30 or 40 years ago, so the richest people in the country were not as rich as they are now. But because it was also generational wealth, it was just a huge legacy of money that had always been there. So the woman had been raised to believe that everybody wanted her money, and that the only people who could really be trusted were the family, because it was their money too. Terrible upbringing. And as it happened, this woman made friends with some Ananda people, and Swami was traveling and met the woman, and she was quite inspired by Swamiji. And with all her wealth, she was conscious of the fact that if she took up a cause, she could make a big difference in that cause. Swami was never, ever influenced by that. But he got to know her, traveled several times, was a guest in her home. And the woman had particular views, I think it was about the role of women, whatever they would call feminism, if they called it that at that time, just things like that. Not all of which Swamiji agreed with. He didn't have any issues in terms of the rights of women and all of that. That wasn't it. But some of these political things get a little twisted. So he knew what her point of view was, and he didn't quite agree with it. And he knew that that people flattered her all the time, and because of her wealth. You know, they would just give her her way. So Swami was sitting at her dinner table, and he brought up that subject, which he knew was important to her, and he spoke very frankly about what he thought. As a consequence, she sent word that she didn't want to see him ever again, and she never wanted him to be a guest in her home again. And Swami was very sad. He said he felt Ananda could really have helped her. He said, but I wanted to be sincere. He said, people around her are not sincere. I wanted her to be sincere. He said she would just find out sooner or later that not everything she said I agreed with. So I thought it was better just that she know right away and let her make up her mind. And he was very sad about it, though, because he really felt that we had true friendship to offer her. But he disagreed with her on some point, and that was the end of that. And I've seen it happen before. And as I said earlier, all of us who were able to sort of stick with it with Swamiji had to be able to have him, contradict cherished ideas of ours and have the strength of character either to, understand, well, always to understand what his objections were. And if one had a fair answer, which this woman had some good answers to Swami, you're practicing differently. Yes, that's true. That doesn't change my point, but that's true. So we would have to always be able to work it out with him. And if you couldn't stay, because you had to have a certain strength of character. You couldn't just get away with being sentimental and sloppy in your thinking around him. It just didn't work. So now, this is a different letter, entirely, completely different subject. This is a potpourri of different things. This was about 1977. I remember this. A graduate student asked permission to circulate a questionnaire for his dissertation to Ananda members. I don't know whether this man, he was from Sweden. I don't know whether he was doing a dissertation about Ananda per se or about communities. He was a very nice man. He was with us for a while. He studied us. And then he, in the way of these things, he passed out a questionnaire for his dissertation, which we all answered just because he was a nice man and we wanted to help him get his degree, which he did. Swami says, I wanted to give myself a little time to think over your request before answering your letter. The best I can say is that I don't oppose your asking Ananda members to reply to this questionnaire if you want to. Anything more than that would constitute in some people's minds a request that they try to set time aside to answer your questions. In other words, Swami was not going to use his authority for this man's project. I don't oppose it, but I'm not going to say we need to answer his questions. Swami was always extremely conscious of the influence he had, and he was very careful about how he used that influence. He didn't just allow his name to be just tossed about just because it would be convenient. Well, the word is sincere. He was always sincere. He would endorse and support and suggest. It wasn't that he wouldn't say, we need to help this person, but he would never do it unless it was genuinely sincere. He was always conscious, is really what I want to say. A lot of people are just casual about how they do things. They don't think it through. So he was very conscious. He was especially conscious about his endorsement and his leadership. And for that reason, I felt you could always trust him, because he was sincere. That's the only word for it. And the truth is, Swami goes on to say, I've never felt much in tune with questionnaires of this sort. I find in many, perhaps even in most cases, that a yes or no answer is simply not satisfactory. Human nature is too fluid to be capable of such categorization. So once again, Swami's telling this guy the truth. For instance, I trust my son or daughter. Trust him, her, or her when? With what? Under what circumstances? Or, I try to make special time to spend with my daughter or my son. I can imagine someone who has to try to make special time as being a lot less loving than one who does it naturally, and who therefore might well answer no to this question. I don't know if these were the actual questions on the questionnaire. I filled it out, but it was 40 years ago. I respect my son or daughter. I can imagine lots of circumstances in which respect would not be one's conscious sentiment, and yet the seeming lack thereof might involve a much more practical and therefore more truly respectful attitude than the sort of buddy-buddy attitude assumed by so many ineffectual parents. Oh, Swamiji, this man did go on and get his PhD, and he did use the questionnaire. Or take such a statement as, I do not feel depressed. I think these are imaginary questions, not from the man's questionnaire. I don't think Swami would have undermined the man's work, but I don't actually know. Or take such a statement as Swami really liked this man. We all really liked him. So we answered his questionnaire, which many of us did not think was very, just exactly. I'd never seen this letter, but I had the same feeling about the questionnaire. Sure, I'll give you an answer. But we really liked the man. He was a lovely man. So we were all happy to help him. Or take such a statement as, I do not feel depressed. A yes or no answer here could easily be determined by how a person feels at the moment of answering the question. Or, I never hold a grudge. I've heard a lot of people make statements of this sort out of a very wish to explain away a grudging mood. And so on down the line. I am sure that some good can be got from questionnaires of this kind. It's just that, if asked for an endorsement, I don't see how I can conscientiously give it. If, however, you feel in my lack of opposition to your asking them sufficient incentive to proceed, then at least I can give you this much. And he did. And the guy got his degree. And it was fun, actually. Even somewhere in my own paper files, I think we have a compilation of the results of that questionnaire. At least I used to have it. I don't know if I still do. And it was very entertaining. It just had a lot of fun facts, about the consensus of opinion within Ananda about a variety of questions and subjects, none of which I remember at the moment. But it made me happy that I wasn't in academia. I lasted a year in college, and I actually lasted 2 weeks. I stayed for the rest of the year, but I lost interest in academia after 2 weeks. I had this funny encounter, I hope you find it funny, with two friends of mine, and they were both in academia. They were professors at various places. I mean, being a college professor was probably where I was going. Well, no, I never was, because I dropped out of college now that I think about it, but it was the natural direction of my life, that I would be that kind of intellectual, and been there, done that is probably the actual explanation of it. But I went out to dinner with this couple, and they were both in academia, and she was in some kind of research. I don't think it was scientific. I think it was psychological or something like that. And she was in a very difficult position because she had gotten this grant to do this research, and the expected result was not coming through. The expected result was not happening, and the research was going to prove that something other than what she hoped it would prove. And this was a huge crisis in her career. Now, I'm such a child in these matters because I just dropped out of adult society at a very young age, and I never re-entered it. So I had to quiz her to find out. So you got a grant to research a question, you've researched it, and you have an answer. You have researched the question, you've solved it, and you have an answer. But the problem is, the answer is not the answer that you hoped it would be, and so this is creating a crisis. I said, forgive me, but isn't that what research is supposed to find out? That's like, and so I sort of turned away from the table, and I just laughed for a few minutes. Then I came back and tried to sort of deal with the fact that indeed this was a crisis. So what were we going to do about it? But out of the mouths of babes, which is who I was at that point, what is the purpose of research? If you already are just proving what you already believe to be true, how can you call that research? It's just nuts. Now, I know that's not always the case. Just like Swami says to the psychologist, there's other good things that happen, but it's very hard. You try to reduce all these things down, to tidy boxes. And that's what Swami's saying. You can't take human nature and put it in tidy boxes and then tie it up and then count it. 6 or 4, 7 or against, and so that's the truth. There was a conclave of Protestant ministers. Yeah, I think that's what it was. They were Protestants. And they went through the Bible and they voted on, I don't even remember what they were voting on, but they were voting on whether Jesus actually said it or something like that. And they just voted. And if the majority of them thought that Jesus said it, then they marked it as legitimate. And if they were they thought that Jesus hadn't said it, then they voted it down. And it was just like, this is not how truth is arrived at. It just isn't how you find truth. When Swami wrote Revelations of Christ, the entire thesis of that book, it's a marvelous book if you haven't read it. And it's quite different than a lot of Swami's writings, and it's totally different than the Bhagavad Gita. The Bhagavad Gita is verse by verse, verse commentary, verse commentary. His book about Christianity, the Revelations of Christ, is not scripture commentary. It's not verse commentary like that. And it's kind of an intuitive book. Of course, everything Swami writes is intuitive, but it's not, it doesn't progress A to B to C to D like this. It's just this flow of intuitive energy. And the thesis of that book is really simple. Who has a right to speak for Christ? And his answer is those who share his consciousness. And not academicians, not theologians, not historians, not novelists or playwrights. It's people who share his consciousness, saints, avatars, because they're the only ones who can know what he really meant. Everybody else is just making it up, just guessing. And Swami writes with great compassion how incredibly confused people who love Jesus are. Those who love Jesus are being terribly confused because historians, theologians, novelists, and playwrights are telling us what's true about Jesus, but they don't know. And every so often I read these, historical remakes of what was really going on and who was really who, and no, it's just they don't know. I mean, every so often somebody will do a dramatic retelling that has integrity, but much of the time it doesn't, because who has the right to speak? Those who share the consciousness. So this is where, Swami's talking about human nature, and my friend was talking about, I believe it was psychological research of some kind. But it's just more complicated than that. There has to be some perception from a higher level to really understand this. We can't just keep rewriting it. People are reinventing the characters and rewriting, and fortunately, Master's also spoken very strongly, and it's we can find our way. So let's go back to, where are we? Oh, now we're into something super interesting here. The following two letters, discuss the book Henry I by Warren Hollister. They were sent to Hollister's assistant, Amanda Frost, who, using Hollister's notes, completed the final 2 chapters of the book after Hollister himself died. Okay, so here's what's going on here. Well, it says here too. Paramahansa Yogananda stated that in a previous incarnation he was William the Conqueror. Swami Kriyananda has said privately that he believes he was William's youngest son, Henry I. So William the Conqueror, of course, is very well known. He was the French, the Norman duke who felt he was the rightful heir to the English throne, and so he crossed the English Channel and he conquered, so to speak, that country, and he established what became England. England didn't really exist until William created it. What Swamiji writes in other writing that when Master made the statement that he had been William the Conqueror in a previous life, first you start with the thought that you don't think of an avatar taking a role like that. You don't think of him as being a warrior king. It's just not the first thing that comes to mind, because William's work seems secular, not religious. So you have a hard time thinking about an avatar taking a role like that. So first, it just kind of bends one's whole way of thinking about what an avatar is doing in the world and why an avatar would take incarnation. So that was part of it. Swami also said that he was educated until the age of 13 in the British, in a British curriculum, not an American curriculum, in which William the Conqueror was considered to be quite a villain, because the proud British people felt that this Frenchman, this Norman, had come in and taken over their country. Now, Swami subsequently, and it was very disconcerting for Swami to find out that the great villain of English history was his own guru. He just jokingly, but he said he really didn't know what to do about that. So he did a lot of independent research on William and discovered that the commonly held view of him was completely inaccurate, and that William was a extremely spiritual person, no surprise. All his friends were saints and monks, and he never missed a day of Mass in his life, Swami said. And in an age when uniformly kings paid no attention to monogamy or faithfulness to their wives, that William was absolutely faithful to his wife, and on, many other things. And he was a great patron of monasteries and helped establish the church and just did many things that were very important. And then Swami, for various reasons, came to believe that he'd been Master's physical son in that lifetime, the third of his three sons, who became King Henry I. And King Henry I was a king who there wasn't that much written about in history, because what he did was he consolidated the achievements of his father. And he made no effort to sort of conquer worlds on his own, to make his own mark. He simply took what William had started and he secured and consolidated it. And in fact, much of what became English law and English customs was actually the work of Henry after William's passing, because it was possible in the 30 years that followed. Henry's reign lasted for 30 years, and it was one of the most peaceful and prosperous and harmonious kingships in all of English history. So it was really quite remarkable, and that was Henry I. So there is there was this historian, I believe he was at some university in Southern California, but I'm not sure, whose name was Warren Hollister. And he wrote, I'm not sure he wrote about William, whether he wrote about William also, but he might have. You know, he wrote these very, very well-researched academic type books, but very interesting. Warren Hollister, and there might be one about William, and there's definitely one about Henry. It was his specialty. And Swamiji came across them after Warren Hollister had died, because he died before he finished the book, and his assistant, Amanda Frost was the woman's name, finished the books. So Swami has said privately in 2002, but he became quite public about it. In fact, Catherine Kairavi, a longtime resident of Ananda, at Swami's request, actually spent many years doing her own research, and then wrote a book called Two Souls, Four Lives. And it was about the parallel lives of Yogananda, Kriyananda, and William and Henry, and all the overlapping characteristics. And it's a marvelously interesting, extremely well researched, and fascinating book about this whole thing. So now Swami also corresponded with Amanda Frost and talked to her about Henry. So dear Dr. Frost, Swami writes in January of 2002, thank you for writing. The difficulty I have with too many historians is that they don't, like P.G. Wodehouse's butler Jeeves. Do you enjoy Wodehouse? Parenthetically, he asks her. Study the psychology of the individual. I love he starts writing with P.G. Wodehouse. In the P.G. Wodehouse stories, the Bertie and Jeeves story, Jeeves, the butler, is always referring to the psychology of the individual as one of the secrets of why he's so successful in getting Bertie out of the ridiculous jams that the author gets him into, is because Jeeves studies the psychology of the individual. So Swami starts there. They study situations and statistics, but show an unsatisfactory knowledge of human beings. Most of them haven't had to work with actual people, nor tried to understand them. What I like especially about Hollister's and your book is that you make a real effort to enter into Henry's nature, placing yourself in his shoes. I think the result is masterful. Very, Swami never stinted if he really liked something. But he also gave reasons. This is why it's a good book. I could see, of course, from all those footnotes, that both of you had expected a lot of opposition from your colleagues and had wanted to reply to them as fully as possible when your book came out. This is why academics put a lot of footnotes. Part of the academic story, I was talking to a friend who got a PhD. I was asking her, what is this? She said, when you write a PhD dissertation, you're having a conversation with everybody who has ever talked about this subject. She said it's like they're all sitting around the table with you. And then if you take the subject to another step by the dissertation you're writing, you have to answer every objection that the people around the table are going to raise. So you put in a lot of footnotes. You said the reason I think this is because of this, and I know that so-and-so said that, but this is the answer to it. And you do that in your footnotes so that you can keep going in your text. So she says, I could see from your footnotes that you expected a lot of argument about what you said. I hoped you wouldn't be hit with it, but from my own experience of life, well, one just is. I knew, of course, that you couldn't argue Henry's lack of selfish motive, assuming the thought arose in your minds, which it may have done. Twice in the book, you felt it necessary to make it clear that you weren't depicting him as a saint, though it was clear you thought him basically good. I quite understand, both because there's no reason to say that he was a saint, and because others would certainly have lambasted you if you'd stepped so far out from the traditional line. Because one of the characteristics about Henry, and what Swami said people often misunderstood, is that he didn't have selfish motive. And he said many historians just couldn't believe that. So they were always trying to, he says, make a case for Henry's selfishness, like it was so well hidden because so many kings and monarchs were completely self-serving. The idea that a monarch could actually just be serving his father's vision and the good of his people was just really hard to swallow. So they tried to, break new ground by showing that there was something else going on. The reason I wrote of his devotion to duty, I guess this is the second letter, the reason I wrote of his devotion to duty was that he confined his ambitions to reestablishing his father's domain. Had he had personal ambition, as Robert Curthose, who was his older brother, as Robert Curthose did, he'd have gone on to seek at least some personal conquest for himself. Instead, he didn't try to seize Wales or Scotland as his successors did. He won them over. Again, he's talking about Henry's unique character. Yes, he was pragmatic, but I think he was also doing what he felt was his duty. Thus, to my mind, there was human feeling involved in his way of ruling. He was loyal, I think, by nature, since he showed such loyalty to his father's legacy. He was loyal when he could be, and expected loyalty of others. Being also pragmatic, however, he worked from his practical understanding of others. He seems, however, to have been hurt by people's betrayals of loyalty. He was a human being, not a machine, and seems to have felt deeply, judging from many accounts in your book. I feel that I am empathetic. I feel that I empathize with him, having had to encounter many difficulties of a similar nature in my own life. It is from that sense of empathy, of projection, that I believe, perhaps wrongly, that Henry's delays were, yes, a tactic, but were also due to natural hesitation, based on a wish to get it right, and to let what we today would call the energy flow work itself out until clarity came of itself. So he's explaining Henry's character. And then speaking very specifically, his abandoning that siege in response to Anselm's threat of excommunication suggests to me that he was also anxious to keep himself in the right with God's will. These are historical events where Anselm was the Archbishop of Canterbury, and there was a certain point where the Pope was involved, and he had opinions about what was going on, and Anselm was a loyal ally of Henry, but the Pope was involved and excommunication was involved. It was very marvelously dramatic. So Henry was engaged in a serious military campaign, and then he got word that if he continued it, he would be excommunicated, which was a super serious thing in those days. It wasn't anything like what we think of now. To be excommunicated from the church meant that you were facing eternal damnation, which is a pretty serious thing to risk. So he gave up his siege of the city. This, too, could have been a reason for some of his delays, because some people thought that Henry didn't have a spine, because he was deliberate, he was not impulsive, and he would shift his tactics when he felt it was appropriate. And some historians tried to show that this meant he was weak. But Swami is saying not at all, and Hollister didn't think he was weak. Hollister understood. Swami's confirming that. I don't think it's unrealistic to suggest that Henry may also have been influenced by remorse over his impetuous execution of Conan. Henry was rarely brutal in the way he dealt with opposition, but there was this man named Conan, and I believe Swami had left him, Henry had left Conan in charge. Conan absolutely betrayed Henry, set up some kind of a rebellion. When Henry came and put the rebellion down, he took Conan up to a high tower and pushed him off, just executed him. So it was a rare thing that Henry behaved that way, but he felt that an example had to be set. But he said remorse over his impetuous execution of Conan. But this is what I've done in my own life. I may be only projecting where Henry is concerned. The establishment in every field is a hard castle to storm. I'm not surprised you're encountering resistance, though I believe your book will end up being accepted as the standard work on Henry I. It is an heroic work. Perhaps you'd be interested in seeing the first chapter of my new book, Hope for a Better World. I'll include it as an attachment. The book is finished and is even out already in Italian. In America, we are trying to get pre-publication comments before the book is actually published, hopefully in March. Having the reader's only copy has given me a chance to work on polishing it further. You ask where I live in Italy and why I live in the hills above Assisi and speak and lecture in Italian at a retreat. No, he says, where I live in Italy and why. Swami says, I live in the hills above Assisi and speak and lecture in Italian at a retreat I founded years ago, to which I finally, in 1996, felt drawn to come and live in. It is a branch of a group of communities and retreats that I found in America. The first of them was established in 1968. All of them bear the name Ananda. I also feel at home in Europe, having been born and raised until the age of 13 in Romania. My parents were pure-blooded American, which is to say the typical American mongrels. So though I'm American and was raised speaking English, I also spoke Romanian and German fluently at the time, and then learned French when I was sent to school in French Switzerland. I've always felt at home in Europe. The second reason I'm here is that people kept asking me to come here. Finally, I decided I'd better learn to speak and lecture in Italian. People visit Ananda Ritiro from all over the world, especially, of course, from Italy and nearby countries. The next time you visit Europe, perhaps you can visit here. I'm more or less retired now, so might find myself free enough to take you and your husband around a bit. It was good of you to write. Best wishes on the reception of your excellent book. Sincerely, Donald Walters. Let's see what else he says here. So here's another letter to Dr. Frost. This was written a month later. This was written almost a year later. December. The last one was January of 2002. This is December. Dear Amanda, they must have exchanged a number of letters in between. This is one of those nights I have when I wake up at 3 o'clock and can't get to sleep again. Since you're leaving for France so soon, I'll just jot down a few thoughts for you. You may not get them until your return. First, I think you must be a very busy person, and am hesitant about intruding. But I'm happy you answered, finally, as you put it. So maybe there was no letter in between. My friend is not a historian. Oh, he's talking about Catherine Kairavi, who's also writing on the same subject. My friend is not a historian, but is the wife of a medical doctor. She does quite a bit of writing, writes well, is literate, and would enjoy a bit of change in the subject she writes about. I suggested, after reading Hollister's book, that this might be an interesting challenge for her, and she liked the idea. She does seem to be pursuing it, but I've no idea so far how she has come. Okay, let me just see what's going on here. What is not included, let me just think about this. See, somewhere he tells her, which I love, he just tells her that he believes he was Henry. So she's an academic historian. He's been discussing with her this book that he thinks is so good. And that somewhere in the correspondence, and maybe we're going to encounter it later, I don't think it's in this letter, but he does say that he believes that he was Henry in a last life. Her response to it is, well, maybe you can explain a few points that I don't quite understand. So they did exchange a number of letters with him speculating about things Henry did based on his own intuitive feeling. It was a wonderful response from her. I remember when it came. Well, that's interesting. That makes you quite a source that I don't have. So let's hear about it. So when he's talking about, I'd mentioned Catherine Kairavi wrote the book about 2 souls, 4 lives. So he must have explained all that to her, which tells me that there were letters in between about his saying that he was Henry in a past life. And so they're just talking here about academic things. It'll be a relief for her to know that another historian won't be writing her book about Henry, and so on. And then he starts talking here. There are many definitions of love. This must be continuing conversation where she's asking him to explain Henry's character. There are many definitions of love. To me, right at the top comes loyalty. Soon after that, friendship, practical support, goodwill, respect. Sentiment and desire come far down the list. I want to just read that again because that's a great paragraph. There are many definitions of love. To me, right at the top comes loyalty. Soon after that, friendship, practical support, goodwill, respect. Sentiment and desire come far down the list. I can imagine Warren and me liking one another. That's what I feel from his book. I felt that affinity with you also from your letters and from the last chapters of his book, which I believe you said you wrote for him. I feel an affinity with Henry also, and must of course be careful, therefore, not to project. But in my own life, I've learned about loyalty and friendship. I've been in a position somewhat comparable to that of Henry, not in ruling people, obviously, but in leading many hundreds. And while I haven't land to give them, or money or power, I've learned that by seeing and appreciating them in terms of their interests rather than of my own, countless numbers feel loyal to me in a way they never would have been if I'd tried to buy them with favors. Wow, that's very interesting, isn't it? I try to help them with their interests rather than buying them with favors. And I think that was how Henry worked also. Henry made friendship, and people loved him. And he just didn't operate in the way that kings operated at that time, nor did William, for that matter. They operated on a higher level. That's what I don't like about Judith Green's, this other historian's, insights. She seemed to think that a king could only rule with a Machiavellian attitude of buying people's support. So many historians fail to put themselves sufficiently in their subjects' shoes as human beings. So Judith Green must have sort of like, now I'm going to expose Henry for who he really was. You know, academics are as competitive as any other sport. Swami goes on to say, yes, I'm busy writing, no lecturing just now. My last book, Hope for a Better World, will come out in a revised edition in January, and I'll ask my publisher to send you a complimentary copy. There's a chapter on Machiavelli that I think you'll enjoy. In fact, I think you'll rather like the whole book. Have a good trip to France and a wonderful New Year. It's unfortunate that they didn't include the fact that Swami told her that he was a reincarnation, because that's one of the charming things about their correspondence. So, let's see now. I'll read one more. This is January 27th, 1991. A devotee objected to Kriyananda's condemnation of Russian communism. So here we are, Swami just condemning things left and right and people protesting. So Swami spoke against communism. Swami writes, please bear in mind that these teachings of the Masters are practical on all levels of human existence. What I said was based on things Master spoke about. He often said that spiritual truths must be made to apply on all three levels, physical, mental, and spiritual. And he was concerned, therefore, about mundane issues as well as Vedantic truths. This is a misunderstanding that people have, that spirituality exists in a world apart from everyday life. And one of the things that Master himself was trying so hard to correct in his entire mission was to show that these extremely exalted truths apply to everything. And everything that we do as human beings can be carried out from the point of view of self-realization. And the point of communities is to show practically how that really happens. I tried to say to you when you visited here a few months ago that the real issues are not between communism and capitalism, but between total materialism and the higher view, which is increasingly being justified by modern science itself, that behind matter itself there lies a spiritual reality. If money were truly the god of this nation, as you suggest it is, it might well behave us as spiritual aspirants to leave America and reside elsewhere. But one encounters a mixture of values everywhere, and I have also found much more spiritual hunger in America than in any other country, with the possible exception of India. I might add also that your battle is not with me. It is with old ideas in your own mind. So see, this is where Swami starts in on you. We have these on us. We have these cherished ideas about, we don't have cherished ideas about self-realization because we didn't know about it. But we have all these political ideas and social ideas and, gender identity ideas and just all kinds of ideas. Not that they're necessarily wrong, but a great many of them have not been well thought out. That they're just the way we've always felt, or the way people around us felt, or the way that we were raised. And we haven't really applied ourselves to actually think clearly on these subjects. I mean, this is, I speak for myself, but this was well, I loved it, but that didn't mean it wasn't without effort. That you would often, in Swami's company, you would just say something that had always been true to you. And then he would either comment or he would just vibrate. And you would suddenly realize, why do I think that? What is the basis for this thought? And you would realize that you had no basis for it. It was just what I'd always thought. Communism, capitalism, social, political ideas. You just, when you really sometimes tried to think about it, you realize that you really didn't know. And you had to have the courage to really do that. So Swami says, because whatever they're talking about communism and capitalism, I must add also that your battle is not with me. It is with old ideas in your own mind. Long ago, you bought the idea that the communist system offered freedom and equality for all, and that aberrations of the system were the fault of individuals. So in other words, communism is right, and if it doesn't quite work, it's because they're not doing it right yet. Or there's bad people who are trying to do it, but it's still a good and true system. Swami says it's a problem in your own mind, that you long ago made this decision, and now Swami's trying to encourage this person to re-examine his first premise. I can't believe that you thought I was condemning the Russian people. Obviously, there are good and bad people everywhere. It would be naive, however, to claim that there cannot be repressive systems. Repression is the evil. I believe, and Master often said, that the system in Russia is evil because it is repressive. If you disagree, never mind. We are of one mind on the much more important issue, which is that spirituality, not matter worship, is the ultimate solution to human problems. Love in Master. I don't know who we're talking about, but it was some committed communist who had to defend communism even though they're now a devotee, and was defending it with false reasoning. And so is mad at Swami for pointing out his false reasoning instead of realizing that he has to consider his own false reasoning. That's what I mean when Swami would just challenge us. And he wouldn't argue, as I was saying. He would just sometimes hear, if you wrote him a letter, he would write you back. Or if you brought it up, he would discuss it with you. But he didn't enjoy crushing you. It wasn't like he would fight. He would reflect. That's how it would happen with me. I would just say something that I'd always thought was true, or I just made up in the moment and didn't realize I just made it up. I don't know how I would think about it, but it would be sort of like, suddenly I would feel like I was talking down a long, hollow tube. That just like the energy of what I would say would just kind of sit there, and I could just vibrationally feel that this is not I don't have any grounds for this. I have to back up and really think, what do I really think and why do I think it? I mean, I've never thought about communism, so it wasn't an issue, but if it had been, it would be like, listen to what Swami's saying. See if you actually have real answers to what he's saying, or if it's just I want this to be true and therefore it must be true. Defensiveness, in other words. I'm extraordinarily grateful to Swami because he really taught me how to think. And he taught me how to think objectively, and he taught me how to be more, I mean, I'm not perfect by any means, but intellectually honest and not just make up reasons. I remember, let's see, what was the context? Well, you just pick up these things and you just defend them. You find yourself defending ideas you don't even believe. But there was something, Swami's consciousness was so clear and so honest that if you wanted to be sincere and honest, you just couldn't hold an untruth in his company. So let's see. Okay, this one isn't too long. A letter to a friend preparing to visit India. This is 1972, so this is a long time ago. I hope you have a wonderful trip to India. You will find the poverty, dirt, and inefficiency hard to take. It may drive you up the wall to have to spend a half an hour to an hour in a bank just to cash your traveler's checks, to wait hours for a phone call to go through, to find people saying things just to please you rather than being truthful. 1972 was early on in the history of India. India has become very politically minded and has lost much of her spirituality, though I am convinced only temporarily. But if you can get down underneath all these distractions and overlook the noise, bedlam is more like it, the crowds, and the confusion, you will find the age-old blessings are still there. India, the real India, is an ancient culture that has survived the disintegrating influences of time, but has endured many scars in the process. The real India is a land of forest ashrams, simple folk living close to nature, the sound of bhajans sweetening the night. That India has been disrupted by the turmoil and anguish of foreign conquest and domination, by the religious fanaticism of some, and by the even more corroding influence of cynicism from the English. That India is almost hopelessly overcrowded and unable with its village attitude to cope with the crowds. It is aware of its poverty and will have to go through a phase of materialism and of modernization, including urbanization, practical efficiency, and factories. I think that the real spirit of India may burn more brightly for a time in America, where many Hindu souls are being born, drawn to a country that has passed through the worst of its materialism without losing its innate love of nature and of higher values. In an ashram like Ananda, the spirit of India flourishes. And in time, I am sure that India will recover her balance and return to the kind of simple living which modern progress also makes possible. India will always be the guru of this planet. For now, however, it may be that her teachings are sometimes better received abroad than at home. Love from Swami. Isn't that interesting? Swamiji said he'd moved to India 30 years after he wrote this letter. It was 30 years before Ananda started to work in India when Swami moved there. And then, by then, India has become extremely modern. I first went to India in 1986, and from 1986, just my little span, the whole country completely changed. And when Swami was there, he defended all the modernization. He defended even the materialism. He said India is far too important on the global stage to remain an impoverished backward country. He said it must enter into the modern world to take its rightful influential place. And he says it's a phase India is going through because the true power of India will reassert itself. And he lamented but didn't regret. He said it's simply necessary. This is what has to happen. And that is what's happening. You see this, great power coming forward. But he also said at one point that, many Hindu souls are being born in America, and many Western materialists are being born in India to sort of help bring about a necessary balance. And then just many souls are crowding in for various reasons that have not yet been revealed. When I would travel in India, which I did a lot with this pilgrimage group, we would often meet, and the only thing I can think to call them is the real Indians. We would meet real Indians, which was not determined by where you were born, but by whether you really had the consciousness of what India was. And almost always at some point they would say to us, because we were a group of Americans, they would sort of lean over and say, kind of, there's a lot of people incarnating here who are not really Indians. And they would say it just like that. We don't really know who they are either, but they're just sort of filling up the land for now. And that the necessary balance will come back. And it is, and it will. God is in charge. Anyway, that was a very sweet letter from Swami. So my friends, God bless you. Thank you for spending this time with me. I hope you've enjoyed Swami's company as much as I have. God bless you.